for this week's direct instruction, we are going to discuss some characteristics of poetry and one form in specifically. Poetry, many students find difficult because the authors don't often come right out and tell you what the poem means or what message or theme they're trying to convey. Instead, they paint a picture through words. Poetry. It aims to present ideas and evokes or suggests emotions in the reader through a variety of characteristics and forms. So what this means is that through the language that the author uses, they're trying to present various ideas to you or to make you feel emotions. And they do this by the special ways that they put the words together. As you look through poetry and as we read poetry in this class, it's important that you take note of the following characteristics and forms of poetry. These characteristics especially are the way that the author conveys his ideas and the emotion to you. Some of the characteristics of poetry. Poetry paints a picture through words. One of the types of words that it uses, or one of the techniques that poets use, is imagery. Imagery is a word or a group of words that appeal to one or more senses. When a poet is using imagery, they're calling upon your sense of sight, taste, touch, hearing, and smell. So then they use adjectives and other words to describe things so that you can almost experience them as you read. Symbolism is another device that poets use. It's a device in literature where an object represents data or represents something else. For example, the American flag is a symbol of the United States. The heart, the shape of a heart, is often used as a symbol for love, and things like that. A couple more characteristics. Figurative language is a huge part of poetry, reading poetry and understanding poetry. Figurative language can't be taken literally. You can't look at it word for word most often. You have to take it as the group of words or read it as part of the whole poem. And it's meant to create a special effect or a feeling. And there are a lot of different types of figurative language that poets use. The first type that I'd like to talk about are metaphors. When a poet uses a metaphor, they describe one thing as something else. And this is a comparison that does not use like or as. For example, the house was a zoo this morning. The author here is saying that the house was a zoo. It was, and this is, the house wasn't really a zoo. There weren't bears and lions and tigers running around, but they're trying to convey to you the idea that the house was crazy. There was things going on everywhere. There were people running around. It was loud. It was noisy. And they did that through saying that one thing is something else. In this case, the house is a zoo. A type of figurative language that is very similar to a metaphor are similes. The difference between metaphors and similes is that a simile uses like or as to compare two unlike things. For example, he stormed into the room like a tornado. He's not really a tornado. He's not this big tunnel of debris and swirling air. No, he is coming into the room loudly, making a lot of noise, kind of like maybe stomping or stamping his way in. So you're comparing him to a tornado. Some more types of figurative language. Idioms. These are expressions that are not to be taken literally. They have hidden meanings or they stretch the truth. For example, one common idiom that people use is, "It is raining cats and dogs." Well, You probably know that when somebody says it's raining cats and dogs out there, you're not going to look out the window and see kittens and golden retrievers falling from the sky. What they mean is that there's lots of water coming down. There's big raindrops and buckets of water, and it's a really heavy rain. Idioms are especially difficult for non-native English speakers because the idioms are language specific. And that their meaning is learned through use of language. So when a non-native speaker hears idioms, they often become very confused. Hyperbole is an exaggeration or an overstatement. This would be the example would be, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. Well, you're not really going to eat a 1,500-pound animal. What you're saying is, I'm really hungry, I need a lot to eat. So that would be an example of hyperbole, an exaggeration. And here's another example. My brother exploded when he saw the damage to his car. He didn't really break into lots of pieces and your brother. Instead, this is emotionally he exploded. He got upset. He got defensive. Another example of figurative language is personification. This is when we give human qualities to something that is not human. The best example that you've probably heard many times is the piece of cake was calling my name. Well, the cake is an inanimate object. It doesn't have a mouth. It doesn't have the ability to speak. So it can't really be like, hey, Mrs. M, come over here, take a bite. But what it means is, by it sitting there, you have this want and this desire for it that you can almost not control. And by giving it the verb calling, you're giving it a human characteristic. Other things that authors use or poets use when they're writing poetry are sound devices, and they're used to add to a poem's mood and meaning. Alliteration is one sound device that you're probably pretty familiar with, which is the repetition of consonant sounds at the beginning of words, such as dark, dangerous dogs. The D sound is repeated at the beginning of every word, and that would be an example of alliteration. Assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds followed by different consonants. So in the case of blade and maze, we have the same A sound. Consonance is the repetition of similar consonant sounds at the ends of words, and here we have the D sound at the end of wind and sand. A couple more sound devices that you should be familiar with. Repetition. This is just the use of a sound, word, phrase, or sentence more than once. Oftentimes in ballad poems, there will be a stanza that is repeated throughout the poem that is often like a chorus on a song, and that would be an example of repetition. But repetition can be a single word as well. Nevermore in Poe's The Raven would be an example of repetition. Rhyme, it's the repetition of sounds at the ends of words, like speech and teach. We have the CH sound. Oftentimes, you're familiar with end rhyme, where there's a specific rhyme scheme within the poem, and the last words of certain lines will rhyme with each other. Rhythm, which is the pattern or beat of a poem. Certain poems like haikus or limericks have a specific rhythm to them and a pattern of beats. Couple more sound devices. Meter. That's the rhythmical pattern in a poem. So not only do we have rhythm, we also have meter. So the pattern would be repeated throughout the poem. Onomatopoeia, which is the use of words that imitate sounds. Words like hiss, crash, bang, chomp. Those would. A little bit about poetry organization. Poetry is organized into stanzas, and these are groups of lines that are similar in length and pattern and are separated by spaces. So when you look at a poem visually, where there's a break between a group of lines, that would indicate a change in a stanza. A stanza is like a paragraph of poetry. It states and develops a single main idea. So normally when you move from one stanza to the next, there'll be a shift in the idea or the information being presented in the poem. Specifically, what I would like you to look at this week are acrostic poems, which you're probably familiar with. I'm sure you've been doing them for years, and this is just a kind of a fun little exercise for you to try. An acrostic poem is a poem in which the first letter of each line spells out a word or a message. So if you look at the first letter of every line vertically, there will be either a word or a message there for you. And then each line of the poem describes something related to this word or message. And on the next slide, I have an example for you. This is an example of an acrostic poem. It is called Edgar Allan Poe. If you look down the left-hand side of the poem, you will see that the first stanza, the first letter of each line spells Edgar. The second stanza, the first letter of each line spells Allan. And the last stanza, the first letter of each line spells Poe. Okay. If we read the poem, eerie stories and poems decorate our imagination. Both good and evil are challenged along with reality. Also, love and insanity lurk through the pages in anthologies. You will never know what is to happen next. Problems of murder and mystery, oddities and wonderment are expressed with such peculiarity only he could achieve. So not only is his name the beginning of each line, but the subject of the poem is his writing. Your assignment for this week is to create an acrostic poem using the word Thanksgiving in appreciation of our holiday. Within your poem, you need to use at least one simile, one metaphor, one example of alliteration, one example of onomatopoeia, and one example of hyperbole. You should underline your examples within your poem. You don't have to label them. I should be able to figure out which one they are, but make sure you underline them so I can find that you have an example of each of the required elements. You should submit your poem in the submission box for this assignment. So, because each line will start with a letter in the word Thanksgiving, I expect the topic of the poem to be things that you are thankful for, or possibly a description of your own Thanksgiving. You can kind of decide how you want to take it, but remember that the lines should be related to the overall topic, which in this case would be Thanksgiving. If you have any questions about this assignment or about any of the things in this week's lesson, please make sure that you message me, and have a good Thanksgiving.